The late August sun bore down on the dusty roads of Ellinwood, Georgia, as Grace Washington stepped out of her black 2009 Honda CR-V. The air was thick with humidity, and cicadas hummed in the trees like a steady drumbeat. She paused for a moment in the driveway of her new home, a modest, one-story brick house with chipped paint and overgrown hedges, and drew in a deep breath. This wasn't Atlanta. It wasn't even close. She had lived in Atlanta for nearly 2 decades, working at Grady Memorial Hospital, raising her teenage son Devin, and surviving a difficult divorce that had left emotional scars deeper than she let on. But when her Aunt Ruth passed away, leaving her this small home in a town she'd only visited once as a child, Grace took it as a sign. Maybe a smaller place would be better. Slower. Simpler. But simple didn't mean easy. Not here. Not in Ellinwood. The first sign came at the gas station. She'd stopped to fill up on her way into town. An elderly white man in a flannel shirt and ball cap watched her closely from the other side of the pump. When she nodded politely and smiled, he didn't return the gesture. He spat on the pavement, muttered something under his breath, and walked off. It wasn't new. Grace had grown up with racism, institutional and direct. But she'd hoped, in 2025, people might have grown up a little. She was wrong. Her first day at Ellinwood Regional Medical Center began with a lukewarm welcome. Grace Washington, a thin, blonde nurse called from behind the desk, peering at the clipboard. "Oh. You're the transfer from Atlanta?" "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied with a warm smile. "Excited to join the team." The nurse looked her up and down, dark skin, tight coiled hair in a neat bun, navy blue scrubs pressed and pristine. "Well," the nurse said flatly. "You'll be on floor 2. Dr. Fisher's team. Just keep your head down. People around here don't take well to city folk." Grace didn't miss the subtext. It wasn't about the city. On the second floor, the hostility was more direct. In the break room, conversation stopped when she walked in. One nurse, a heavy-set man named Troy with a loud laugh and a louder mouth, made a show of moving his coffee cup to the far side of the table. "You know," he said, not looking at her, "we don't usually get Atlanta types up here. Guess they ran out of places down there?" Grace smiled politely and poured her coffee. "No, sir. I just thought I'd bring a little compassion where it's needed." Troy scoffed. "We got enough compassion. What we don't need is attitude." Later that afternoon, during rounds, Grace noticed a young black boy in room 214, Isaiah, age 9, who was recovering from pneumonia. His mother, a woman named Laverne, had bags under her eyes and fear in her voice. "The other nurse, she ain't been checking him like she should. He had a fever all night," Laverne whispered. "They said it was just his kind overreacting again." Grace's jaw tightened. She stayed with Isaiah for an extra hour, monitoring vitals, updating charts, even calling the attending physician, something most nurses in that ward avoided unless absolutely necessary. By the time she clocked out, Grace had already been labeled a problem. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind pine trees, Grace went to the local grocery store, a family-owned shop called Klein's Market. She needed eggs, milk, and a bit of normalcy. As she walked down the aisle, 2 teenage girls whispered behind a cereal display. A moment later, a small box of pasta flew toward her cart and bounced off. "Oh no," one girl said mockingly. "Must have slipped." Grace ignored them, continued shopping. At checkout, the cashier, a teenage boy named Brett, scanned her items slowly, glaring. "We don't take EBT here," he said before she'd even taken out her wallet. Grace raised a brow. "That's fine. I'm paying with a card." He muttered something again, eyes cold. When he handed her the receipt, he didn't say thank you. Back home, Grace sat on the front porch, a glass of sweet tea in her hand, the cicadas still loud in the trees. Her phone buzzed. "Devin. Hey Ma, first day okay?" She typed slowly. "It's different here. But I'm okay. Love you." But she wasn't okay. Not really. Not yet. The weight of being the only one, the only black woman on staff, the only one some folks had seen in years, felt heavier than she'd expected. The glances. The silence. The suspicion. But Grace didn't crumble. She'd seen worse. She'd survived worse. And she hadn't come here to run away. She came to build something new roots, even in old soil. A few days later, she found herself walking to her mailbox when a familiar pickup truck rolled by, Troy from the hospital. He didn't wave. Didn't look. But the woman in the passenger seat, his wife, maybe, did. And she stared at Grace like she didn't belong. Grace didn't flinch. She turned. Smiled. And waved. Sometimes, kindness is louder than anger. Sometimes, it's the beginning of something much bigger. The following week in Ellinwood passed like honey through a funnel, slow, sticky, and suffocating. Grace arrived early each morning at the hospital, not just out of professionalism but as a shield. She needed the quiet moments before the others came in, the only time she didn't feel eyes drilling into her back. In Atlanta, she was respected. In Ellinwood, she was watched. Like an outsider with a ticking clock. It wasn't just her coworkers. Even patients eyed her with a subtle, acidic suspicion. Some older white men refused to let her take their blood pressure. A woman in her 60s insisted Grace had dark hands that made her nervous. The worst part wasn't even the words, it was how normal the racism felt here. How quietly it wore its boots. But things came to a boil on Thursday. It started with a simple, everyday task. Grace was covering room 302, a patient named Edna Miller, 84 years old, in for post-operative care following a minor gallbladder removal. Grace checked her chart, reviewed her vitals, and did her usual, warm voice, a gentle touch, patience. Edna responded coldly. "I asked for Stephanie," she snapped. "She's off today," Grace said kindly. "But I'll be with you all morning." Edna clutched her purse like it might float away. "I don't want you in here by yourself." Grace didn't respond to the insult. She adjusted Edna's four-line and began recording notes. 15 minutes later, she exited the room. By noon, the whispers began. Grace was restocking bandages in the supply room when Troy stormed in. "You were in 302 this morning?" "Yes," she answered slowly, standing upright. "Is something wrong?" He crossed his arms, towering. "Mrs. Miller's diamond bracelet is missing. One she always wears." Grace blinked. "I never saw a bracelet. She wasn't wearing any jewelry when I came in. It should have been logged during admittance." "She says it was there this morning," he said with an edge of smug certainty. "And she says you were alone with her. You're the only one who touched her things." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "So now you think I stole it?" "I didn't say that," he said, but his tone said otherwise. Moments later, hospital security arrived. A white man in a gray vest with a badge clipped to his belt gestured for her to step aside. "We'll just need to take a quick look through your locker." Her hands trembled. "You have no cause. I'm not under suspicion." "This is just protocol," he said. "No," she replied, firm now. "Protocol is not violating staff rights based on unproven accusations." Troy snorted from the corner. "You'd make it easier if you just cooperated." But Grace stood her ground. The incident was reported to HR. An internal investigation was opened. Though they never found the bracelet, not in her locker, her bag, or anywhere else, the damage was done. That night, Grace sat on her front porch, the cicadas again humming, but this time it felt like they were chanting against her. Her tea remained untouched. She felt like an animal in a cage, tolerated, but not trusted. The stain of suspicion had settled in the air, thick like southern fog. Devon's call went to voicemail. She didn't have the strength to talk to her son. Instead, she remembered a story her grandmother once told her. "They won't see you for who you are, baby," the old woman had said. "They'll see you through the eyes of fear, and fear always lies. Friday morning was hell. 3 nurses she'd usually pass in the hallway now turned their heads. In the break room, no one sat with her. At the nurses' station, a younger tech named Amy handed Grace a chart with her eyes averted. She didn't blame them. Fear was contagious. In the cafeteria, as she passed 2 orderlies, one of them muttered, "Should have known better than to trust her kind." Grace froze. Turned. "What did you say?" The man, bald, heavy-set, with a security tag on his hip, smirked. "You heard me." A familiar heat rose in her throat, the kind that threatened to unravel the careful dignity she wore like armor. But Grace didn't explode. She just looked at him, held his gaze until his smirk cracked. "I'm here to heal people," she said. "Even the ones who can't see past their hate." And then she walked away. But the universe works in strange loops. Because later that afternoon, as she finished up charts, the intercom buzzed. Code red. Fire in Wing C. Repeat, code red, fire in Wing C. Grace's pulse spiked. She ran. Smoke was already creeping into the corridor when she reached the wing. Nurses scrambled. Patients screamed. Alarms shrieked. A small electrical fire had started in one of the back rooms and was now threatening to cut off the eastern corridor. Through the smoke, she saw Amy, the tech who'd avoided eye contact earlier, stuck behind a jammed emergency door with a wheelchair-bound patient. Without hesitation, Grace charged into the smoke, pulled the alarm override, and pried the door open. "Come on," she yelled. "Grab his chair, I'll guide." They moved fast. Smoke choked their lungs. The patient was heavy, unresponsive. Grace threw his arm over her shoulder, dragging him with everything she had. By the time they made it back to safety, Amy was sobbing. You saved us," she gasped. Grace didn't reply. She just collapsed to her knees, coughing, eyes burning from the smoke. But word spread quickly. By the end of the day, everyone in the hospital knew, the woman they'd whispered about, suspected, accused, had risked her life to save 2 people. The next morning, her porch was no longer empty. A small note was taped to her door. It read, "Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we gave up on you. A." Next to it was a pie tin, warm, fresh peach pie inside. And for the first time since arriving in Ellinwood, Grace cried. Not from pain, but from the fragile, flickering flame of hope. 3 weeks passed since the fire in Wing C, but Ellinwood still buzzed from the aftershocks. Something had shifted. Grace could feel it in the way people greeted her now. The stares had softened. The silences grew shorter. Amy brought her coffee every morning. Even Troy, stiff and awkward as ever, muttered a gruff good job one afternoon while pretending to study a chart. Grace didn't need applause. She wasn't chasing validation. But the change, the subtle hum of acknowledgement in the air, felt like water after a drought. It reminded her why she'd chosen this life in the first place. But peace in Ellinwood was as fleeting as morning mist. And soon, the Rayal storm came. It began with the sky. On a Tuesday morning in June, clouds rolled in like thick bruises. By noon, the hospital lobby echoed with phones ringing, patients rescheduling appointments, staff murmuring about radar maps and emergency broadcasts. Ellinwood had seen storms before. But this felt different. Grace stepped outside during her break, mug in hand. The wind had an eerie silence to it, the kind that presses against your skin like a warning. Trees bent like prayers. The sky pulsed with electricity. Her phone buzzed. Emergency alert, tornado warning for Lafayette County. Seek shelter immediately. Inside, the hospital's PA system crackled to life. All staff, report to emergency protocol stations. Secure all patients. We are now under tornado lockdown. Chaos erupted. Grace didn't hesitate. Her boots pounded against tile as she sprinted toward the pediatric wing. She knew they'd need help moving cribs and calming panicked parents. The lights flickered. In room 107, she found a young mother, Jessica, clutching a toddler with a breathing tube. Her eyes were wild with fear. What do I do? Oh God, is he gonna, what if? Grace put both hands gently on her shoulders. We'll protect him. But I need you calm, okay? We're moving to the basement shelter. I can't carry him and the tank. I've got the tank, Grace said firmly. You take him. Let's go. They moved quickly. Down the hall. Past gurneys. Around wheelchairs. The building groaned beneath the wind's pressure. A thunderous boom cracked overhead, glass shattered somewhere in the east wing. A nurse screamed. Sirens wailed outside. By the time they reached the shelter, a reinforced section of the hospital's sublevel, they were soaked in sweat and dust. More families piled in. Doctors barked orders. Babies cried. Grace didn't stop. She helped an elderly man into a cot. She calmed a boy with autism who was banging his head against the wall from overstimulation. She checked oxygen levels, administered anti-anxiety meds, helped intubate a newborn suffering from distress. One moment, one crisis, one breath at a time. Outside, the tornado touched down. A monstrous, howling fury tore across Ellinwood's outskirts. Trees snapped. Power lines danced like snakes. The town groaned as the earth itself trembled. For 40 terrifying minutes, the hospital became a vessel of survival, held together by sheer will. When it passed, silence fell like ash. And then came the screaming. The main entrance had collapsed. The west wing had partially caved in, trapping several patients under rubble. The ER bay was completely inaccessible, covered by downed beams, glass, and metal. The power grid had failed, and emergency generators only kept lights flickering dimly in the shelter. But worse, Ellinwood's roads were destroyed. Help wasn't coming anytime soon. Inside that wrecked hospital, people turned to each other. And slowly, all eyes found Grace. She didn't hesitate. Start triage rotation, she ordered. Anyone with medical training, we need you. Prioritize red tag patients. I want 4 fluids on every critical, go find the carts. Amy nodded. Got it. Troy, Grace said, locking eyes with him, you're taking the burn unit. There are 2 patients up there with dressings that need replacement ASAP. Don't screw it up. He stared at her for a moment, then nodded sharply. Yes, ma'am. Even the doctors deferred to her. Grace's calm, steady, strong, commanding, filled the void leadership had left behind. Over the next 16 hours, they ran on caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer survival instinct. Grace moved from room to room, checking pulses, stitching wounds, holding hands. She helped amputate a crushed foot under candlelight. She comforted a teenage girl who'd lost her baby brother when the ceiling collapsed. At one point, while rinsing blood from her arms at a mop sink, Grace caught a glimpse of herself in a cracked mirror. Her face was soot-covered. Her eyes hollow. Her scrub top was torn at the sleeve and stained deep red. But she looked like a woman carrying the building on her back. When FEMA finally arrived 2 days later, they found the hospital still standing, barely, and the staff exhausted but alive. The emergency coordinator, a grizzled man with gray hair and boots thick with mud, shook Grace's hand after being briefed. You're the one they kept talking about, he said. They said you saved half this town. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The next week, Ellinwood's local paper ran a story titled, The Angel in Scrubs, How One Woman Led Us Through the Storm. There was a photo of Grace in front of the hospital's remains, arms crossed, bruised but proud. Suddenly, the same people who once whispered behind her back were sending letters. Donations. Volunteers came from nearby towns to help rebuild. A little girl sent her a drawing of a nurse with a cape. Underneath it, in uneven crayon letters. You are my hero. Even Edna Miller, yes, that Edna, sent a note. I was wrong. You're everything this town didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Taped inside was something small and glittering. Her bracelet. Grace held it in her palm, then quietly placed it in the hospital's lost and found. She didn't need it. The storm may have passed, but its imprint was carved into the bones of Ellinwood. From Main Street's cracked sidewalks to the twisted steel of the collapsed West Wing, the town bore its scars proudly. And amid the rubble stood Grace, still strong, still steady, but no longer invisible. A week after the tornado, a town hall meeting was held at the community center, one of the few buildings still intact. Folding chairs lined up between plywood walls. Children clung to their mothers' legs. FEMA agents sat near town officials. Pastor Don opened with a prayer. And then, something remarkable happened. "Let's recognize someone," said Councilwoman Renee Carter, her voice breaking slightly. "Someone who didn't just work through the storm. She carried us." Grace shifted uncomfortably as all eyes turned toward her. She hated attention. But when the crowd rose to their feet in a slow, swelling standing ovation, she couldn't hide the tears that welled in her eyes. Applause thundered. Not a golf clap. Not polite appreciation. A reckoning. A thank you. An apology. All in one. The following weeks brought change in ways Grace never could have predicted. The hospital was shut down for temporary repairs, so staff were dispersed to neighboring towns or reassigned to mobile medical units. Grace opted to stay in Ellinwood, helping run one of the makeshift clinics set up inside the local high school gymnasium. Lines wrapped around the block. People came in limping, coughing, bloodied, bruised. But something about Grace's presence, the way she looked people in the eye, remembered their names, spoke without ego, calmed them before she even lifted a stethoscope. She wasn't just healing bodies now. She was rebuilding trust. One afternoon, Troy showed up early to the mobile clinic. He looked different. Less arrogant. The edge in his voice had dulled. "Need a hand?" he asked, holding out a box of bandages. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Volunteering or sentenced by HR?" He gave a crooked smile. "Neither. I wanted to be here." She didn't press. She just nodded and tossed him a clipboard. From then on, they worked side by side. It wasn't friendship, exactly, not yet, but it wasn't war either. Respect was growing in the soil between them. Even Amy started opening up. One day, over stale vending machine coffee, she admitted, "I used to envy you. You walked in here with all this confidence, and I didn't know how to deal with that." Grace tilted her head. "You didn't envy me. You were afraid." Amy winced, then nodded. "You're right." But she stayed with Grace the rest of the shift. That meant something. Then came the accident. A call came in through the emergency walkie. A school bus, carrying students to a local summer camp, had collided with a freight truck just outside of town. There were multiple injuries. Some critical. Grace didn't flinch. She grabbed gloves, gauze, morphine kits. The gymnasium transformed from clinic to trauma center in minutes. Blood. Screams. Splintered bone and shredded skin. It was chaos. And in the center of it, like always, was Grace. She triaged without hesitation. Gave orders. Talked one boy through a compound leg fracture. Stitched a gash so deep it touched muscle. She worked until her arms shook and her mask soaked through with sweat. But despite every effort, one child didn't make it. 8-year-old Caleb Murphy. He bled out before the chopper arrived. Grace sat on the floor beside his stretcher, numb, her gloves soaked in red. She didn't cry, not yet. She just stared at the stillness that had taken over the boy's body. She felt hollow. Later, in the silence of an empty storage room, she let the tears come. She hadn't cried in years. Not like this. But in that moment, she wasn't a nurse. She was a woman carrying grief on top of grief, and for once, she let herself break. What she didn't know was that someone had seen her. Derek, Caleb's father, a tall, quiet man who'd once sat in the front pew at the same church where people used to whisper about Grace, stood outside the door, watching her weep. He could have hated her, blamed her, cursed her name. But instead, he stepped inside and knelt down beside her. "You did everything you could," he said, voice trembling. "I saw it. We all did." Grace looked up, shocked. "I'm so sorry." Derek's hand shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny, red friendship bracelet, the kind kids make at camp. "Caleb made this for you," he said. "He said you were the coolest nurse. He wouldn't stop talking about how you helped his grandma after the storm." He placed it in her palm. And for the second time that day, Grace cried. Word spread fast. About how Grace had tried to save Caleb. About how she worked through the night without eating. About how she held the mother's hand when they turned off the monitor. The town came together in a way it never had before. At the next town memorial, Pastor Don invited Grace to light the ceremonial candle. And as she stood at the front, her hands still trembling, the entire community stood with her. Not behind her. With her. That night, as she walked home past the remnants of the old hospital, Grace paused. The moon cast a silver light across the debris. Wind rustled through twisted metal. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We're getting there." Then she looked forward. And kept walking. The sign went up one morning without warning. A large white banner fluttered in the breeze, strung across the crumbling gates of the Ellinwood Regional Medical Center. Rebuilding together, coming spring 2026. And just beneath it, Grace Thompson Healing Wing. Grace stood frozen on the sidewalk, keys still in hand, grocery bag hanging off her wrist. She blinked. Read it again. And again. Someone must have made a mistake. Or a joke. But the workers in orange vests waved at her like she was royalty. Councilwoman Renee Carter was on site, clipboard in hand, beaming with pride. "You didn't think we forgot, did you?" she asked, walking up to Grace. Grace's voice came out rough. "You're naming the wing, after me?" Renee shrugged. "You earned it." But Grace felt unsteady, like she was standing on one of those fault lines that split her past and present in two. "I'm not from here. I wasn't wanted here." Renee looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "That might have been true once. But you changed us." The weeks that followed were a blur of blueprints, meetings, community fundraisers, and volunteer rallies. Troy led an initiative through the fire department to help clear out debris. Amy organized a bake sale that raised nearly $8,000 in one weekend. Children from the local elementary school drew pictures to be sealed in a time capsule in the hospital lobby, many of them featuring a brown-skinned woman with a stethoscope and a glowing smile. Grace wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was becoming the soul of Ellinwood. And still, she remained humble. She worked her shifts in the mobile clinic. Checked on the elderly stuck in temporary housing. Helped rebuild fences and shovel mud with the same hands that once stitched wounds. One day, she visited Miss Loretta, the old widow who'd broken her hip during the storm, and helped her hang a new set of wind chimes on the porch. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Loretta said, squinting at her. Grace smiled. "A tired nurse?" "No, child," Loretta whispered. "I see an answered prayer." But just as Ellinwood was settling into its season of renewal, the past came knocking, wearing an expensive suit and a guilty look. Malcolm Holloway. Grace hadn't seen him in over 8 years. Not since she left Atlanta. Not since he let his rich daddy's lawyers bury the harassment case she filed, the one that cost her her first hospital job and nearly shattered her career. He was standing outside the clinic one morning, briefcase in one hand, bouquet of lilies in the other. Grace's entire body tensed. "What the hell are you doing here?" Malcolm cleared his throat. "I came to say. I'm sorry. Too late." "I know." He stepped back respectfully. "But I also came with an offer." My company, Holloway Ventures, is investing in rural medical redevelopment. When I heard about Ellinwood's plans, I pushed to allocate funding. Millions, Grace. Enough to make your healing wing a reality. Her mouth opened. Then shut. She didn't trust it. Didn't trust him. But the town needed it. And she'd be damned if her pride cost them something that could save lives. Still, she gave him a glare that could cut through steel. You don't get to buy redemption. I'm not trying to, Malcolm said softly. I'm just trying to do something right. She turned and walked away, heart pounding. She didn't say yes. But she didn't say no, either. That night, Grace sat on the porch of her rental house, staring up at the stars. Troy stopped by with 2 beers. They drank in silence for a while. You okay? He asked. She shook her head. No. He nodded. Want to talk? She didn't. But she did. So she told him. Everything. The job she lost. The humiliation. The silence from the boardroom. The way she had to rebuild her career from scratch. The crushing loneliness. The fury. The long nights crying in tiny apartments. The shame. Troy listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You know what I see when I look at you? She gave him a tired look. If you say an answered prayer, I swear. He laughed. No. I see the strongest damn person I've ever met. She smirked. You're not half bad yourself, Fireboy. A month later, the town broke ground on the new wing. News crews came. The mayor spoke. And Grace, reluctantly, took the podium. She wore a simple white blouse and jeans. No script. No podium theatrics. Just heart. I came to Ellinwood thinking I'd stay for 6 months, maybe a year. I didn't think I'd belong. And, truthfully, for a long time. I didn't. She looked out at the crowd, so many familiar faces now. Even the ones who once glared at her now leaned forward, listening. But this town taught me something. It taught me that roots aren't always about where you're born. Sometimes, they're about where you bleed. Where you build. Where you choose to plant yourself. She held up the bracelet Caleb had made. The red string, faded but intact. This was given to me by a boy who reminded me that healing is not just medical. It's human. Thank you, for letting me be part of your healing. And for helping me with mine. The applause shook the stage. And Grace, for once, let it wash over her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Grace stood at the edge of the construction site. She placed a small wooden box into the cornerstone foundation. Inside, the bracelet, a photo of the mobile clinic team and a handwritten note. To the ones who broke and built. May the future know our stories, and stand stronger because of them. Grace Thompson. She covered the box with her hands. And smiled. The new Grace Thompson Healing Wing opened on a warm spring morning. Sunlight poured through the glass walls as patients, doctors, and neighbors filled the bright lobby. There were fresh flowers on every desk, children's drawings framed in the hallways, and a plaque at the entrance that read, Compassion heals. Courage unites. Grace stood in the back, hands tucked in her pockets, overwhelmed. She had done it. They all had. But peace never lasted long in Ellinwood. An explosion shattered the calm. From across town, black smoke curled into the sky. The elementary school was on fire. Panic erupted. Parents screamed. Sirens wailed. Grace ran. When she reached the school, the scene was chaos, fire roaring through the west wing, teachers shouting, children crying. Troy was already there, suiting up. He looked at her, eyes wide. We've got 3 trapped inside, boiler room. You can't go in, Grace. But she didn't stop. She tore through the smoke, lungs burning, eyes stinging, until she found them. 2 boys and a janitor, huddled in the corner, coughing violently. She wrapped them in her coat, led them toward the exit, shielding them as debris fell. A beam crashed just inches behind her. She didn't flinch. They made it out. Grace collapsed on the pavement, soot-covered, exhausted, but smiling. Alive. A week later, the town gathered again, this time for a dedication outside the hospital. The mayor spoke briefly, then stepped aside. Troy took the mic, voice shaking. Grace didn't just save those kids. She saved this whole town, one broken soul at a time. He turned toward her. She taught us to be better. To look beyond skin. Beyond history. She gave us a future. The crowd clapped. Some cried. Grace, seated nearby in a wheelchair with her arm bandaged, looked down, overwhelmed. Then Caleb ran forward and hugged her, hard. "You're my hero," he whispered. She smiled through tears. That night, as the town lit candles in front of the hospital, Grace stood beside the plaque. Her reflection glowed faintly in the glass, not as a survivor, not as a victim, but as a builder. A healer. A light. And in Ellinwood, that light would never fade.